They burned the Apache woman's home until the Black Rancher rode into the flames to save her. History doesn't just bury its darkest chapters, it burns them to ash. Arizona Territory, 1879, where hatred didn't discriminate, but courage did. She's just another Apache. Let it burn with her inside. No one will miss her kind around here. When settlers decided to cleanse their territory of those they deemed unwelcome, they didn't expect a man who knew persecution firsthand to challenge their twisted justice. What awaited inside those flames would change not just 2 lives, but reveal a truth about humanity that many weren't ready to face. The question isn't just who survives, but what kind of life awaits those who dare to defy the prejudices of their time. Why you need to watch until the end. What you're about to witness isn't just another Western tale. This is the story history tried to erase, where a Black Rancher and an Apache woman found themselves united against a hatred that threatened them both. By the final chapter, you'll witness a moment so powerful that it changed an entire community's view on what it means to be human. If you've ever wondered how true courage looks in the face of impossible odds, or how redemption can emerge from the ashes of cruelty, you need to stay with me until the very end. This story isn't just about a rescue. It's about what happens when 2 people from worlds that were never meant to intersect find strength in each other that neither knew they possessed. If you believe in the power of human connection to overcome the darkest prejudice, hit that subscribe button right now and join the Black Rancher community. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that in our darkest moments, heroes emerge from unexpected places. Solomon Davis wiped sweat from his brow as the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on his shoulders. 4 years he'd been working this patch of hard, unforgiving land, and 4 years he'd been fighting to make something of it. The 20 acres he'd claimed under the Homestead Act weren't the richest soil, but they were his, the first thing he'd ever truly owned. "Come on now," he murmured to the stubborn steer refusing to move along the fence line. "Ain't got all day for your contemplations." At 36, Solomon's face carried the weathered lines of a man who'd seen more than his share of hardship. Born into slavery in Georgia, freedom had come to him not as a gift, but as something he'd seized during the chaos of war, riding west with nothing but determination and a skill with horses that few could match. The town of Copper Springs lay 5 miles east of his modest ranch. It was a place he visited only when necessary, for supplies to sell his cattle or to mail the occasional letter to his sister back in Kansas. The townsfolk regarded him with a mixture of reluctant respect and thinly veiled suspicion. He was useful, one of the best horse trainers in the territory, but he would never be one of them. "Mr. Davis! Mr. Davis!" Solomon turned to see young Jamie Porter, the 12-year-old son of the general store owner, racing toward him on a winded pony. "Whoa there, boy. What's got you riding like the devil's on your tail?" Jamie's face was flushed, his eyes wide. "There's trouble in town, sir. Bad trouble. A group of men from the mining company. They're saying an Apache woman stole from them. They've gone to her place, that small cabin up by Willow Creek." Solomon frowned. "What Apache woman?" "The one who sells those herb medicines. The widow. Some folks call her the medicine woman." Solomon knew of her, though they'd never spoken. She lived alone on the outskirts of Apache territory, in a no-man's land between the reservation and the town. She kept to herself, appearing occasionally to trade her herbal remedies for supplies. Some claimed she'd been married to a cavalry scout who'd died, leaving her in that precarious position, neither fully accepted by her own people nor by the white settlers. "What are they planning to do?" Solomon asked, though the knot in his stomach told him he already knew. Jamie's voice dropped. "They're saying they're going to teach her a lesson. My pa tried to stop them, but they were liquored up. They had torches, Mr. Davis." Solomon was already moving toward the corral, where his stallion, Midnight, stood alert, as if sensing the urgency. "Jamie, ride back to town. Find Sheriff Taylor. Tell him what's happening." "Sheriff's gone to Tucson for the week, sir." Solomon paused only briefly before continuing to saddle Midnight. "Then find Deputy Miller." Jamie's face fell. "Deputy was with them, sir, leading them." Something cold and hard settled in Solomon's chest. Of course, Miller had never made secret his views on the local tribes. "Get on home then, boy. This ain't your trouble." As Jamie reluctantly turned his pony back toward town, Solomon mounted Midnight, checking the Winchester rifle secured in its saddle holster. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, but neither was he one who could turn away when injustice rode so boldly in the light of day. Midnight seemed to understand the urgency, responding instantly to Solomon's commands as they galloped north toward Willow Creek. As they crested the ridge that overlooked the small valley, Solomon saw the smoke first, black and thick, then the orange glow of flames consuming the small cabin nestled against the hillside. 7 or 8 men on horseback circled the burning structure, shouting and firing occasional shots into the air in drunken celebration. Solomon recognized most of them: miners, ranch hands, and yes, Deputy Miller, distinguishable by his badge catching the firelight. "She's still in there," one of them shouted, followed by raucous laughter. "Let her burn, one less savage to worry about." Solomon's heart hammered in his chest. For a moment, just a moment, he considered turning back. This wasn't his fight. He'd learned long ago which battles could be won and which would only lead to more suffering. Then he heard it, a woman's scream from inside the burning cabin. Without another thought, Solomon urged Midnight forward, racing down the hillside towards certain danger, his decision made not by calculation, but by something deeper, something that recognized in that distant cry a pain he understood all too well. Solomon's approach didn't go unnoticed. As Midnight thundered down the slope toward the burning cabin, the circle of riders broke apart, some turning to face this unexpected interruption. "Davis, what the hell you doing here?" Deputy Miller's voice carried over the crackling of the flames. His face, illuminated by the fire, showed surprise quickly hardening into hostility. Solomon didn't slow Midnight's pace. "There's someone in there, Miller." "Ain't your concern, boy. Turn around and ride on home." The casual use of boy, a word designed to diminish, to remind Solomon of a place Miller believed he should remain, might have stung once. Now it merely confirmed what Solomon already knew about the man. "Can't do that," Solomon called back, guiding Midnight around the edge of the gathered men, his eyes fixed on the burning structure. The cabin was small, just one room with a lean-to addition on the side. Flames had already consumed most of the roof, and thick smoke poured from the single window and door. The heat was intense even from 50 yards away. Miller spurred his horse to intercept Solomon. "This is official business. That Apache witch stole mining company property." "What property?" Solomon demanded, finally pulling Midnight to a halt. "Medicine supplies, valuable ones." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Since when do you take an interest in Apache thieving?" Another scream came from inside the cabin, more desperate this time. Solomon met Miller's gaze steadily. "That sound like a thief to you, or a woman about to burn to death?" One of the other men, a rancher named Donovan, whom Solomon had sold a horse to just last month, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Miller snapped. She knew the consequences. Solomon had heard enough. He urged Midnight forward again, this time circling wide around the group of men. He could feel their eyes on him, calculating, wondering how far he would go, how far they would let him go. As he approached the burning cabin, the heat became nearly unbearable. Midnight snorted nervously, fighting Solomon's guidance. 20 feet from the door, Solomon dismounted, giving the stallion a firm slap on the flank to send him to safer ground. "Davis, I'm warning you," Miller shouted. Solomon ignored him, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth as he approached the cabin. The door was partially open, flames licking at its edges. Inside was a hell of smoke and fire, the roof beams already starting to collapse. Behind him, he heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. "One more step and I'll shoot you where you stand," Miller called out. "That's a murderous Apache in there. You help her. You're aiding an enemy of this territory." Solomon turned slowly to face the deputy, aware of the critical moment stretching between them. Miller sat atop his horse, rifle aimed squarely at Solomon's chest. The other men watched in tense silence, their earlier bravado subdued by this unexpected confrontation. "She's a woman burning alive," Solomon said evenly, "and you call yourself a lawman." Something in Miller's face twisted. "I'm the law here, not you." "Then God help us all," Solomon replied, and without another word turned and plunged through the burning doorway into the inferno. Inside, the smoke was so thick he could barely see 2 feet ahead. The heat pressed against him like a physical weight, stealing the breath from his lungs despite the bandana. "Where are you?" he called out, dropping to his knees where the air was marginally clearer. A weak cough answered from the far corner. Solomon crawled toward the sound, eyes stinging, lungs burning. Through the smoke, he made out a figure huddled on the floor. The woman was conscious but barely moving, one leg pinned beneath a fallen beam. As Solomon reached her, he saw her face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her late 20s, with features that spoke of mixed heritage. Apache, certainly, but perhaps Mexican as well. Her dark eyes fixed on him with confusion and fear. "I'm here to help," he said, moving to examine the beam trapping her leg. It was heavy but not impossible to lift. "Can you move if I free your leg?" She nodded weakly, coughing. With a grunt of effort, Solomon heaved the burning beam upward, ignoring the searing pain as embers fell on his arms and shoulders. The woman dragged herself free, wincing in pain. A thunderous crack sounded above them as another section of the roof began to give way. There was no time for gentleness. Solomon scooped the woman into his arms and turned back toward the door, now barely visible through the thickening smoke. Each step was a battle against heat and falling debris. The woman in his arms was light but limp, her consciousness fading. Solomon's lungs screamed for clean air, his eyes watering so badly he was navigating more by memory than sight. When they finally burst through the doorway into the relatively cooler air outside, Solomon gulped in desperate breaths, the woman still clutched tightly against his chest. They'd escaped the cabin just in time. Behind them, the remaining roof collapsed with a roar of flame and sparks. Miller and his men sat motionless on their horses, faces etched with disbelief and something that might have been shame. In the firelight, the tableau must have seemed unreal. A black man emerging from the flames carrying an Apache woman to safety against all odds and against their explicit threats. Solomon ignored them, carrying the woman to a safe distance from the burning structure. He gently laid her on the ground, noting with relief that she was breathing, though each breath came with a painful wheeze. "Water," she whispered, her voice raspy from smoke. Solomon turned toward the men. "She needs water." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, surprisingly, it was Donovan who reached for his canteen, riding forward to offer it. Solomon took it without a word, helping the woman take small sips. As her breathing steadied, her eyes found Solomon's, a question in them that needed no translation. Why? Why would he, a stranger, risk everything for her? Before Solomon could respond, Miller's voice cut through the crackling of the still-burning cabin. "This doesn't change anything, Davis. You just interfered with the law." Solomon stood slowly, turning to face the deputy. His voice, when he spoke, carried a quiet authority that made even Miller pause. "What law says you can burn a woman alive in her home? Show me that law, Miller." Miller's face reddened. "She's an Apache thief." "She's a human being," Solomon interrupted, "and whatever she might or might not have done, nothing justifies this." He gestured toward the burning ruins. A murmur ran through the other men. The drunken courage that had carried them this far was fading, replaced by the sobering reality of what they'd nearly done and what Solomon had just witnessed them do. "This ain't over," Miller warned, but even he seemed to recognize that the moment had shifted. With a disgusted gesture, he wheeled his horse around. "Come on, boys, let's go." One by one, the men followed, some avoiding Solomon's gaze, others staring openly at him and the Apache woman with expressions ranging from confusion to lingering hostility. As they rode away, Solomon turned his attention back to the woman, who was now trying to sit up, her eyes fixed on the remains of her home. "Everything," she said softly. "Everything I had." In those 3 simple words lay the full measure of her loss, not just shelter, but history, identity, survival itself. Solomon knelt beside her. "What's your name?" She hesitated, studying him with eyes that had seen too much betrayal to trust easily. Finally, she answered, "Nizhoni." Then, Perhaps recognizing his unfamiliarity with the Apache language, she added, "It means beautiful in your tongue." "I'm Solomon Davis," he replied. "Can you stand? We need to get away from here. They might come back." Nizhoni attempted to rise but collapsed with a gasp of pain. "My leg." Solomon examined it carefully in the firelight. Not broken, he thought, but badly bruised and possibly sprained from the fallen beam. "I have a ranch," he said. "It's not much, but you'll be safe there until you heal." Suspicion flashed across her features. "Why would you help me?" It was a fair question, one Solomon had asked himself as he'd ridden toward the burning cabin. The answer came to him not as a carefully considered thought, but as a simple truth. "Because there was a time when no one helped me," he said, "and I swore I'd never be that person who turns away." Something in his words reached her. After a long moment, she nodded, accepting both his answer and his offer of help. As Solomon whistled for Midnight, who trotted obediently back to his side, the burning cabin collapsed completely, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Nizhoni watched silently, her face illuminated by the flames consuming her past. "They will not forget this," she said, as Solomon helped her onto Midnight's back. "Neither the men who did this nor their families." Solomon mounted behind her, securing her in place with one arm as he took the reins with the other. "Neither will we," he replied, guiding Midnight away from the scene of destruction and toward an uncertain future. 3 days after the fire, rain came to the parched Arizona landscape, a gentle, persistent shower that turned the dust to mud and filled the air with the sweet scent of wet sage. Solomon stood on the porch of his small ranch house, watching droplets cascade from the eaves while Midnight and the other horses huddled beneath the shelter of the corral's lean-to. Inside, Nizhoni slept on his narrow bed, her injured leg wrapped in poultices she had instructed him to prepare from plants gathered near the creek. Solomon had taken the floor these past nights, sleeping on a bedroll near the fireplace, an arrangement that had raised no discussion between them, just a mutual understanding that propriety, even in these unusual circumstances, mattered to them both. The rain provided a welcome respite from the tension that had followed them from the burning cabin. No riders had appeared at his property line. No messenger had come with threats or warnings. The silence was both a relief and a cause for unease. Solomon knew too well that hatred rarely burned itself out so quickly. The cabin door opened behind him. Nizhoni stood in the doorway leaning against a walking stick Solomon had fashioned for her from a sturdy oak branch. "You should be resting," he said. "I have rested enough." She moved carefully to stand beside him, watching the rain. 3 days I have taken your bed, eaten your food, used your supplies. You're welcome to them." A small smile touched her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Among my people, such generosity creates a debt that must be repaid." "No debt between us," Solomon assured her. Nizhoni studied his profile. "The men who burned my home, they are your enemies now too." It wasn't a question, and Solomon didn't treat it as one. They both understood the reality of what his intervention meant in a place like Copper Springs. "They were never my friends," he said simply, "but they tolerated you before. Now." She let the implication hang in the rain-heavy air. Solomon had considered this carefully over the past days. His position in the community had always been precarious, respected for his skill with horses and cattle, but never accepted as an equal. His rescue of Nizhoni had crossed an invisible but significant line. It wasn't just that he had challenged Miller's authority or interfered with the group's actions. It was that in choosing to save Nizhoni, he had declared a side in a conflict that defined the territory itself. "I've lived with worse than their disapproval," he finally said. Nizhoni nodded, understanding more than he had spoken. "As have I." After a moment, she added, "I need to collect herbs for my leg. The pain is returning. Tell me what to look for. I'll find them." She shook her head firmly. "These plants must be gathered with knowledge, with respect. I will show you where they grow." Despite his concern for her injury, Solomon recognized the determination in her voice. "We'll take the wagon. Save your strength." An hour later, They were following a narrow trail alongside a small stream that cut through Solomon's property. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, and Nizhoni directed him toward a shaded area where particular plants grew in the rich soil near the water. As she carefully harvested what she needed, explaining each plant's purpose, Solomon was struck by the depth of her knowledge. These weren't random weeds, but a carefully catalogued pharmacy that she navigated with the precision of a physician. "You learned this from your family?" he asked. "From my grandmother," Nizhoni replied, placing a particular root into her collection basket. "She was a healer among our band. When I was a girl, she would take me into the mountains each season to gather what was needed." "And that's what you did?" "Before—" Solomon gestured vaguely, indicating the events that had led to her cabin being burned. Nizhoni's hands stilled momentarily. "I married a man, a scout for the army, John Redfield. He believed he could bridge the world between our peoples." A shadow crossed her face. He was wrong. Solomon waited, sensing there was more to her story. "After he died from fever 3 winters ago, I stayed in our cabin. The army officers' wives would sometimes come to me when their medicines failed them. I helped deliver their children, ease their pain," her voice hardened, "until the new mining company arrived 6 months ago. They brought their own doctor, a man who sees my knowledge as a threat to his position." "And that's why they claimed you stole medical supplies," Solomon realized, "to discredit you." Nizhoni nodded. "Dr. Harrington told them I took morphine and other medicines from his office. A lie, but a useful one for men already looking for excuses." They worked in silence for a while, Nizhoni gathering her herbs while Solomon held the basket. The simple domesticity of the task belied the weight of what they had shared. Finally, with her basket full, Nizhoni straightened with a slight wince. "This will be enough for now." As Solomon helped her back into the wagon, he noticed a thin column of dust on the horizon, riders approaching his property from the direction of town. His body tensed instinctively. Nizhoni followed his gaze. "They come for me," she said quietly. "They come for trouble," Solomon corrected, helping her settle in the wagon before climbing up himself. "But they won't find you alone this time." The riders, 4 of them, reached Solomon's cabin just as he and Nizhoni returned. Solomon recognized Donovan among them, along with 2 miners whose names he didn't know. The 4th man was Dr. Harrington himself, a thin, severe-looking man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. Solomon stopped the wagon in front of his cabin, positioning himself between the riders and Nizhoni. "Gentlemen," he greeted them neutrally, "you're a long way from town." Dr. Harrington urged his horse forward. "Mr. Davis, I see our information was correct. You're harboring a thief and a fugitive." "I'm harboring a woman whose home was burned to the ground with her inside it," Solomon replied evenly. "A woman who would be dead if I hadn't intervened." "That's regrettable," Harrington said, though his tone suggested it was anything but. "However, the fact remains that she stole valuable medical supplies from my office. The law requires she face consequences." "What law burns people alive, Doctor?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. Harrington's mouth tightened. "I wasn't present for that unfortunate incident. I'm here now as a representative of the Copper Ridge Mining Company to demand the return of our property and to see that justice is served." Nizhoni spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady despite the obvious threat. "I took nothing from you or your company, Dr. Harrington, as you well know." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "Your primitive concoctions have been undermining proper medical treatment in this region for too long, Mrs. Redfield. Several of the miners' wives have fallen ill after consulting you instead of seeking proper care." "They fell ill from the mining dust in their husbands' lungs," Nizhoni countered, "from the contaminated water your operations have created, not from my medicines." Solomon noted how Donovan and one of the miners exchanged uncomfortable glances. There was discord among these men. Not all were as committed to Harrington's cause as the doctor might have hoped. "This is your last opportunity to handle this quietly, Mr. Davis," Harrington continued, ignoring Nizhoni's accusation. "Turn the woman over to us and there need be no further unpleasantness." Solomon's hand moved imperceptibly closer to the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat. "And if I decline your generous offer? Then Deputy Miller will return with a proper posse," Harrington said coldly, "and neither your reputation nor your unusual living arrangements will survive the scrutiny." The implication was clear and deliberately calculated to provoke. Solomon felt a flare of anger but kept his expression neutral. "Dr. Harrington," he said carefully, "I respect that you're a man of education, so I'll explain this clearly. This woman is under my protection on my property. She hasn't stolen anything from you or anyone else. If Deputy Miller wants to bring a legal warrant, signed by Judge Wilson, he's welcome to present it. Until then, I suggest you return to town." For a moment, the tableau held, 4 mounted men facing Solomon and Nizhoni in their small wagon. Then Donovan cleared his throat. "Doc, maybe we should be silent," Harrington snapped. He fixed Solomon with a cold stare. "This isn't over, Mr. Davis." "Not by any measure." "Never thought it was," Solomon replied quietly. Without another word, Harrington wheeled his horse around and rode away. After a moment's hesitation, the others followed, though Donovan cast a backwards glance that seemed almost apologetic. As the dust from their departure settled, Nizhoni let out a slow breath. "He will return, with more men." Solomon nodded, watching the riders disappear over the ridge. "Yes, he will." "I have brought this trouble to your door," she said. "I should leave." "And go where?" Solomon asked, turning to look at her. "Back to the reservation where they barely tolerate you because of your white husband? Or to town, where Harrington and Miller are waiting?" Nizhoni had no answer, and Solomon didn't expect one. They both understood the impossible position she was in, a woman caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "We'll face this together," Solomon said finally, picking up the reins again to guide the wagon the last few yards to the cabin. "First, you'll make your medicine. Then we'll decide what comes next." As they approached the cabin, Solomon couldn't help but notice how the modest structure seemed different now. No longer just his solitary refuge, but something more complicated. For better or worse, his decision to ride into those flames had bound their fates together, creating a fragile alliance against forces that would gladly see them both destroyed. A week passed without further incident, a deceptive calm that neither Solomon nor Nizhoni mistook for resolution. Each day her strength returned a little more. Each day, Solomon rode the boundaries of his property, watching for approaching riders. And each day the tension in Copper Springs grew, like the pressure before a violent storm. The news reached them through Jamie Porter, who appeared at the ranch one afternoon, ostensibly to deliver supplies his father had prepared. "Pa says to tell you there's talk in town," the boy said, glancing nervously at Nizhoni, who sat on the porch mending one of Solomon's shirts. "Dr. Harrington's been meeting with the mine owners. Deputy Miller's deputized 6 extra men." Solomon continued unloading the supplies from Jamie's wagon. "That's so," Jamie nodded earnestly. "Pa says they're claiming the Apache woman—" He stopped, coloring slightly as he realized Nizhoni could hear him. "Sorry, ma'am. They're saying Mrs. Redfield not only stole medicines, but has been poisoning folks with her remedies." Nizhoni's hands stilled on her mending, but her face revealed nothing. "Poisoning," Solomon repeated. "Who exactly is supposed to have been poisoned?" "Mrs. Harrington," Jamie said. "The doctor's wife. She took ill 3 days ago with a terrible fever. Doc's saying it happened right after she drank from the town well, and that Mrs. Redfield must have contaminated it somehow." The accusation was so absurd that Solomon almost laughed. "Nizhoni hasn't left this ranch in over a week. How exactly is she supposed to have poisoned a well 5 miles away?" Jamie shrugged uncomfortably. "Pa says it don't need to make sense. People are scared. And scared people don't ask many questions." After the boy left, Solomon and Nizhoni sat on the porch as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the yard. In the week they'd spent under the same roof, a companionable silence had developed between them, a shared understanding that required few words. "He's clever," Nizhoni said finally. "Harrington. He knows the town fears disease more than anything else." Solomon nodded. During his 4 years in the territory, he'd witnessed 2 outbreaks that had claimed dozens of lives. The memory of those losses remained fresh. "Will they come tonight?" she asked. Solomon considered the question. "No. Miller will want daylight for whatever he's planning. He'll want witnesses. Then we have one night to decide. The simplicity of her statement belied the weight of the choice before them. Stay and face whatever came with the morning light, or flee under cover of darkness. As if sensing his thoughts, Nizhoni added, "I will not run again. I have run enough in this life." Solomon studied her profile in the fading light. In the week since he'd pulled her from the flames, he'd come to recognize the steel beneath her quiet demeanor. She was a survivor like him, shaped by losses that would have broken others. "This isn't just your fight," he reminded her. "No," she agreed, meeting his gaze. "Now it is ours. Which is why I will not ask you to risk more than you already have." The implication was clear. She was offering him a way out, a chance to dissociate himself from her cause before it was too late. Solomon almost smiled at the irony. "Do you think they'll believe I had nothing to do with this if you leave? That they'll welcome me back to town with open arms?" "Perhaps not," she acknowledged. "But a black man alone is one thing. A black man harboring an Apache woman that crosses a line they cannot ignore." "That line was crossed the moment I rode into that fire," Solomon said quietly. "There's no uncrossing it now." Night fell fully, bringing with it a rising wind that whistled through the gaps in the cabin's walls. Solomon lit the lamps and built up the fire, while Nizhoni prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans. They ate in silence, each lost in private thoughts about what the morning might bring. After they'd cleared away the dishes, Solomon retrieved a small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a folded document, his deed to the property, along with a handful of coins and a faded photograph of a woman with Solomon's same determined eyes. "My sister," he explained, seeing Nizhoni's questioning look. "In Kansas City, the only family I have left." He carefully removed the deed, smoothing it on the table. "If something happens to me tomorrow, this belongs to you. It's signed and legal. Porter at the general store is a notary. He can help you if there's any question." Nizhoni stared at the document in shock. "You cannot give me your land." "I can. I am." Solomon's voice was firm. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want to know this place won't go to Harrington or the mining company. They've had their eye on this water source since they arrived." "They will never honor a deed in my name," Nizhoni protested. "Maybe not," Solomon conceded. "But it will give you leverage, something to fight with." Nizhoni's eyes searched his face, looking for understanding. "Why would you do this? We barely know each other." It was a fair question, one that Solomon had asked himself repeatedly over the past days. The answer came to him not as a carefully rehearsed explanation, but as a simple truth. "Because I recognized something in you," he said finally. "Something I've been looking for longer than I realized." "And what is that?" she asked softly. "Someone who doesn't bend, even when the whole world is telling them they should." The words hung between them, simple yet profound in their implication. In this moment of vulnerability, Solomon realized how completely his life had changed in the span of a week, from solitary existence to something with meaning beyond mere survival. Nizhoni reached across the table, her hand covering his. The gesture was small but significant, a bridge between their separate worlds. "Among my people," she said, "we believe that souls recognize each other, that some connections exist before we ever meet." Solomon turned his hand to clasp hers. "My grandmother had a similar saying. She called it knowing your heart's kin." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then, by mutual understanding, they withdrew their hands, acknowledging that whatever grew between them would need time, time that tomorrow's confrontation might not allow. "We should rest," Solomon said, rising from the table. "Tomorrow will come early enough." As they prepared for sleep in their now familiar arrangement, Nizhoni on the bed, Solomon on his bedroll by the fire, a sense of inevitability settled over the cabin. Whatever came with the dawn, a threshold had been crossed that could not be reversed. In the darkest hour before sunrise, Solomon woke to the sound of Nizhoni moving quietly around the cabin. She was gathering certain herbs from her collection, mixing them with focused intensity in a small wooden bowl. "What are you making?" he asked, sitting up. "Protection," she replied, without looking up from her work. And truth. Solomon watched as she completed her mixture, then used her finger to draw symbols on the door frame, the window, and finally on Solomon's forehead and her own. "My grandmother's teachings," she explained, "to help us see clearly when others are blinded by fear and hatred. Whether it was ancient wisdom or simply the comfort of ritual in the face of danger, Solomon found himself grateful for the gesture, this sharing of her cultural strength when they would need every advantage." As the first grey light of dawn seeped through the windows, they prepared in silence, washing, dressing in their cleanest clothes, eating a small breakfast. There was a ceremony to their movements, a dignity that defied the chaos they knew was coming. Solomon checked his rifle, then secured it in its customary place above the door. He had no intention of using it. Doing so would only confirm every fear and prejudice the townspeople held, but neither would he face what was coming entirely defenseless. Just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, they heard it, the sound of approaching horses, not just a few but many moving at a deliberate pace toward the ranch. Solomon and Nizhoni stepped out onto the porch together, standing side by side as the riders crested the rise that marked the boundary of his property. There were at least 20 of them, led by Deputy Miller and Dr. Harrington. Behind them came miners, townsmen, and even a few women, some on horseback, others in wagons. "Quite an audience," Solomon remarked quietly. "They come to witness justice," Nizhoni replied, "though not the kind they expect." As the procession approached the cabin, Solomon stepped forward, his posture straight, his hands visible and empty, a man prepared to face what came with dignity rather than violence. Miller rode slightly ahead of the others, reining in his horse about 20 feet from the porch. His hand rested ostentatiously on his holstered pistol. "Solomon Davis," he called out, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "We've come for the Apache woman. Step aside now and there'll be no trouble for you." Solomon held his ground. "What exactly is she accused of, Deputy?" Harrington urged his horse forward to join Miller. "She is accused of theft of medical supplies, contamination of the town well, and practicing medicine without proper training or authorization, resulting in harm to citizens of Copper Springs." "Serious charges," Solomon acknowledged. "Do you have any proof of these accusations?" "We have witnesses who saw her near the well the day before Mrs. Harrington fell ill," Miller said. "Impossible," Solomon replied calmly. "She's been here on my property recovering from injuries sustained when you and your men tried to burn her alive. She hasn't left my sight in over a week." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not everyone had known the full circumstances of the cabin burning. Miller's face hardened. "You calling me a liar, Davis?" "I'm stating a fact," Solomon replied. "Anyone who claims they saw Nizhoni Redfield in town this past week is either mistaken or lying." Harrington stepped forward, his manner shifting to one of affected reasonableness. "Mr. Davis, I understand you may have been misled by this woman. She's known for her manipulative ways. If you step aside now, allow justice to take its course, I'm sure the community will take your cooperation into consideration." "What justice?" Solomon asked, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "The kind that burns a woman's home with her inside it. The kind that accuses her of impossible crimes because her medicine threatens your business, Doctor." Another murmur, louder this time. Solomon could see uncertainty on some faces. Porter the shopkeeper, the blacksmith Johnson, even a few of the miners' wives. "Enough talk," Miller snapped. "Davis, this is your last warning. Step aside or be arrested for interfering with the law." It was the moment of decision. The precipice that Solomon had known was coming since he'd first ridden toward that burning cabin. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of history and possibility balanced on this single instant. Before he could respond, Nizhoni moved forward to stand beside him, her head held high, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed not Miller or Harrington, but the crowd behind them. "I am Nizhoni Redfield," she called out. "I have lived among you for 5 years. I have delivered your children, eased your pain, sat with your dying. I have asked for nothing but to be allowed to live in peace." A stillness fell over the assembly as she continued. "I did not poison your well. I did not steal medicines. I have only used the knowledge my grandmother taught me, knowledge that was ancient before any of your people came to this land. She pointed directly at Harrington. This man fears what he does not understand. He burns what he cannot control. Ask yourselves, who has brought healing to your families? Who has demanded payment whether you could afford it or not? In the silence that followed her words, an unexpected voice spoke up from the crowd. A woman, pushing her way forward. Solomon recognized Mrs. Donovan, the rancher's wife. "She's telling the truth," Mrs. Donovan said firmly. "When my Thomas was dying of fever last winter, Dr. Harrington said nothing could be done. It was Mrs. Redfield who saved him with her herbs, and she asked nothing in return." Another voice joined in, old Mr. Peterson, whose arthritis had crippled him for years. "She made a salve for my hands. First relief I've had in a decade. Never charged me a penny." More voices rose, testimonials of healing, of kindness, of medicines that worked when conventional treatments had failed. With each statement, Solomon could see the momentum shifting, the certainty in Miller's face giving way to confusion, the confidence in Harrington's expression crumbling into barely contained rage. "This is absurd," the doctor sputtered. "These are primitive superstitions, not medicine. My wife is at death's door because of this witch." "Your wife is ill because you've been dosing her with laudanum for years," came yet another voice. Mrs. Harrington's own sister, stepping forward from the crowd. "Everyone knows it, Edward. Everyone sees how you keep her docile to hide your affairs with the laundress." The crowd's murmur grew to an undeniable rumble of discontent. Solomon watched as the careful narrative Harrington and Miller had constructed began to collapse under the weight of long-suppressed truths. Miller, sensing the shift, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This changes nothing. I have a duty to bring in the Apache woman for questioning. Stand aside, Davis." He drew his pistol, aiming it squarely at Solomon. The crowd gasped, drawing back. Solomon didn't flinch. "Put that away, Miller. You don't want to do this." "Don't tell me what I want," Miller snarled. "Last chance. Step aside." In the tense silence that followed, the sound of a rifle being cocked echoed clearly. But it wasn't Solomon's weapon. It was Donovan's, now aimed steadily at Miller. "Lower that pistol, Deputy," the rancher said quietly. "There'll be no shooting here today." Miller's head snapped toward Donovan in disbelief. "You're taking their side, against your own kind." Donovan's expression was grim. "I'm standing for what's right. Something I should have done a week ago at that cabin." He looked around at the assembled townspeople. "We all should have." One by one, other men in the crowd lowered their weapons or stepped back from Miller and Harrington, physically and symbolically distancing themselves from what had nearly happened. Miller, seeing his support evaporate, slowly lowered his pistol, his face a mask of frustrated rage. "This isn't over," he warned, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, Deputy," Solomon replied firmly. "It is." By mid-morning, the crowd from town had transformed from a potential lynch mob into something entirely unexpected, a working party. Word of what had really happened at Nizhoni's cabin had spread quickly, and with it came shame and a desire for atonement. While Miller and Harrington had ridden back to town alone, their influence visibly diminished. Others had stayed behind, offering their labor to help rebuild what had been destroyed. Some had returned to town only to come back with wagons loaded with supplies, lumber, tools, food, clothing, and even precious glass for windows. Solomon watched from the edge of his property as nearly 30 people worked together under the autumn sun, the frame of a new cabin already taking shape on the site where Nizhoni's home had stood. Beside him, Nizhoni observed the activity with an expression that mingled wonder and wariness. "I still don't entirely understand," she said quietly. "A week ago they would have watched me burn. Today they build me a home." Solomon considered her words. "People are complicated. Sometimes they need to see their own reflection clearly before they recognize what they've become. And sometimes they need someone willing to stand against the tide," Nizhoni replied, giving him a meaningful look. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Porter, the storekeeper's wife, carrying a bundle of fabric. "Mrs. Redfield, I've brought some curtains and linens for your new home," she said somewhat hesitantly. "I hope they'll suit." Nizhoni accepted the offering with grace. "Thank you. They're beautiful," As Mrs. Porter returned to help the other women organizing household goods, Donovan approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Davis," he nodded, then turned to Nizhoni. "Mrs. Redfield, we should have the roof on by sundown. Johnson's bringing his wagon with the stove from his storage shed. Says he has no use for it." "That's generous," Solomon acknowledged. Donovan looked uncomfortable. "It's the least we can do. After everything." The rancher hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Miller's been relieved of his duties. Judge Wilson arrived from the county seat this morning. There'll be an inquiry into the burning and the false accusations." "And Harrington?" Nizhoni asked. "His wife's brother has taken her back to St. Louis. Without her family's money, the doctor will likely move on soon enough." Donovan managed a grim smile. "Seems no one's eager to consult him anymore anyway." After Donovan returned to the construction, Solomon and Nizhoni walked together toward the creek that ran along the edge of his property. Their property now, according to the deed he had insisted on signing over to both their names that very morning. "What happens now?" Nizhoni asked, as they paused by the water's edge. Solomon gazed across the land that had been his solitary kingdom and was now transforming into something else entirely, a place of connection, of possibility. "Now," he said thoughtfully, "we begin again. Both of us." Nizhoni's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they had always been meant to fit together this way. "Two worlds," she murmured. "One path." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the land they now shared, Solomon and Nizhoni stood together at the threshold of a future neither could have imagined just days before, a future built from the ashes of hatred, transformed by courage, and sustained by the most unexpected discovery of all, that even in the harshest landscapes of human experience, connection and understanding could take root and flourish. Behind them, the sounds of community continued, hammers striking nails, voices calling instructions, laughter occasionally rising above the industry. It was the sound of atonement, of bridges being built, not just between logs, but between people who had been divided by prejudice and fear. And in that moment, standing by the creek with Nizhoni's hand in his, Solomon understood that what they had created together was more than just a stand against injustice or a personal sanctuary. It was a vision of what could be, a world where differences were not just tolerated but celebrated, where courage was contagious, and where even the deepest wounds could heal with time and care. The story of the black rancher who rode into the flames to save an Apache woman would be told and retold across the territory for generations to come. But the greater story, the one that would truly change hearts and minds, was only just beginning. If this journey through the Arizona territory of 1879 moved you, please hit that subscribe button right now to join the Black Rancher community. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful, untold stories of courage, connection, and redemption on the American frontier to light. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that in our darkest moments, standing for what's right can ignite change that transcends boundaries of race, culture, and prejudice. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until our trails cross again, remember that true courage isn't found in riding with the crowd. It's found in riding toward the flames when others turn away.